The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, chapter 16.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do men say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the powers of death shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. Now from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Now Peter took him and began to rebuke Christ, saying, "God forbid, Lord, this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. For you are not on the side of God, but of men." The Gospel of the Lord. The great turning point in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptics, is this moment at Caesarea Philippi. Up to this time, as you read the accounts in all three of those Gospels, the disciples really don't have a clue as to who this Jesus is. It's at this moment at Caesarea Philippi when Jesus says, "Well, you've been listening to the crowds, you've been hearing comments, what do they say about me?" And then they recount, "Well, some think that you're John the Baptist come back from the dead." For you may remember that Jesus began his ministry in the wake of John's arrest and then his execution at the hands of Herod. Others, they go on to say that you're Elijah come back from the dead. You may remember Elijah, the great prophet, kind of the archetype of all the prophets of the Old Testament, had been taken up in a chariot of fire. And then they go on to say, and others say that you're Jeremiah, the great prophet who's come back. And then Jesus zeroes in on them and says, "And who do you in the plural in the Greek, who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter, speaking up on behalf of all the disciples, says, "You are the Christ. You are the Messiah. You're the promised one. We've got it now. We've got it figured out." And Jesus says, "Oh, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. You know this only because the Father has revealed it to you." And Peter, upon this rock, namely Christ himself, I will build my church. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. What a wonderful moment that must have been for Peter. And I suspect that he just got filled with all kinds of giggle And I doubt very much that at that moment he even understood what Jesus said or even heard what he said about, this is revealed to you by my Father. Peter just absorbed it into himself. I mean, after all. That's what we all do. Feed the old ego. And how clearly do we see that? In that Jesus then begins the second part of his ministry, namely turning toward Jerusalem. Now they knew who he is. This is the turning point in the gospel. Now Jesus turns toward Jerusalem and facing his death. And he journeys from Caesarea Philippi toward Jerusalem and the cross. And during that trip, there are 3 different times that Jesus says here for the first time. The Son of Man must go to Jerusalem, suffer at the hands of the scribes, chief priests, the elders, and be put to death, and in 3 days rise again. Peter didn't have a clue what Jesus was talking about, nor did the disciples. And in fact, in all 3 instances where Jesus says this, as he journeys toward Jerusalem, they just don't get it. And of course, it's obvious that they don't get it because when he dies on the cross, they all flee, hide. Peter denies him 3 times, even though hours before that he said, "Oh no, I'll go to the death for you." And of course, the minute there was any hint that Peter might be in jeopardy, he says, "I don't know the man. I don't know him." Boy, does that sound typical, huh? Now, well, I know that story myself. 3 times over, Jesus makes this comment. And in the wake of the first time, Peter doesn't get it like they don't in the second or third. And Peter immediately turns on Jesus. Here, Peter is full of this knowledge about the Messiah and all of that. And then suddenly, he's going to go and be put to death at the hands of his enemies? This is incomprehensible. Peter just goes bananas. And he goes at Jesus. And Jesus immediately turns around and says to Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan. You are not on the side of God, but on the side of men." Now, what in the world is taking place?